The night my daughter told me I was too old to be trusted with my own money, I smiled at her and I poured her more coffee. And I did not say a single word about the appointment I had the next morning with a lawyer she'd never heard of. I was 71 years old. I had buried my husband 14 months before, and my three grown children had just sat around my kitchen table and decided out loud, in front of me, like I was already gone, how they were going to divide up my house, my land, and the $81,000 their father left me. They thought I'd be alone forever. They thought alone meant helpless. What none of them knew, sitting there eating my pie, was that I'd already made up my mind. And by the end of that week, every assumption they had about the quiet old woman who raised them was going to come apart in their hands. My name is Eleanor. Most people call me Nell. I live in a farmhouse on the edge of a town in Ohio that you have never heard of and never will, and I've lived in it for 46 years. My husband was named Frank. We were married for 49 years, 3 months, and 11 days, and if you think a woman doesn't count it out to the day once the man is gone, then you have never loved anybody the way I love that stubborn, decent, impossible man. Frank died in the spring. It was his heart, which surprised nobody, because he'd worked that heart hard for 74 years and never once asked it for mercy. He went in his sleep, in the bed we'd shared since Nixon was president, and I woke up next to him, and I knew before I even touched him. The house was too quiet. A house knows when a man has left it. I laid there for a while in the gray morning light, holding his hand while it was still warm, and I said thank you because that was the only thing that felt true. Thank you for all of it. And then I got up, and I made the calls, and I became a widow, which is a word I still cannot quite fit inside my own mouth. I want to tell you about my children, because you'll need to understand them for the rest of this to make any sense. I have three. Diane is the oldest, 52, and she is sharp as a tack and twice as cold. Though I love her and I know somewhere under all that sharpness, there's the little girl who used to fall asleep in my lap during church. Diane married money and then made more of it. And she lives in a house with a kitchen bigger than my whole downstairs. And she has opinions about everything, especially about me. Then there's Michael, 49, my only son, and if I'm honest, my soft spot always was. Michael never could hold on to a dollar or a wife, and he's on his third of each, but he has a way of looking at you that makes you forget every dumb thing he's ever done. And the baby Carol, 46, who lives 2 states away and calls me every Sunday and cries on the phone and means every tear and still, somehow, always needs something by the end of the call. I love them. I need you to hear that before I tell you the rest, because the rest is going to make you think, I don't. I love my children the way you love your own hand. But loving somebody and trusting somebody are two different animals. And it took me until I was 71 years old and freshly widowed to finally learn the difference. It started at the funeral. Isn't that a terrible thing to say? But it did. Frank wasn't in the ground 3 hours before Diane found me in the church kitchen, where I'd gone to be alone with the coffee urns because I couldn't bear one more person telling me he was in a better place. She came in with that look on her face, the business look, and she put her hand on my arm, and she said, Mom, I don't want to bring this up today, I really don't. But we need to talk soon about the house, about your situation. You can't stay out there by yourself. My situation. My husband was still warm in the earth, and I already had a situation. I said, not today, Diane. And she said, of course not today. And she squeezed my arm, and I watched her walk back out into the crowd. And I understood something with a clarity that frightened me. She'd already been thinking about it, maybe for a while, maybe before Frank was even gone. The house I was standing in had become, in my daughter's mind, a problem to be solved. And I was the complication. For the first few months after, I'll admit, I was too broken to fight anybody about anything. Grief does something to your spine. It takes the starch right out of you. I moved through those days like I was underwater, and my children took my silence for agreement, and they started, gently at first, to make plans for me. Michael was the one who brought up the money. He came out to the farm one Saturday, alone, which should have told me something because Michael never does anything alone if he can help it. He sat at my kitchen table and he ate 2 pieces of pie, and he talked about the weather and his new job selling boats. And then, real casual, like it just occurred to him, he said, hey, Mom, so that money Dad left, the 81, you just got it sitting in the bank? I said it was in the bank, yes. He said, because that's That's just losing value sitting there. Inflation. I've got a guy, Mom, a real smart guy, does investments. And I was thinking if you wanted, we could put some of that to work. I could handle all of it for you. You wouldn't have to lift a finger. I looked at my son, my beautiful, broke, thrice divorced son, who at 49 had never once managed to hold on to his own money, offering to manage mine. And I felt something I had been feeling more and more since Frank died, a kind of cold understanding sliding into place, like a bolt in a lock. I told him I'd think about it. That's what I'd started saying to all of them. I'll think about it. It's the most useful sentence a widow owns. It sounds like yes if you want it to. It buys you time. And I was going to need time. Because here's the thing they none of them knew. Here's the thing Frank knew, and I knew, and nobody else on this earth knew. Frank and I were not broke, not even close. The 81,000 in the bank, the number they were all circling like crows, that was the small money. That was the money we kept where it could be seen. Frank never trusted banks with the real money, not after he watched his own father lose everything in a savings and loan back in the 80s. Frank believed in land. He believed in things you could walk on and put a fence around. And over 49 years, quiet as a mouse, that man had bought land. Not our farm. Everybody knew about the farm. 160 acres, worth a good bit, but nothing to write home about. No. Over the years, whenever we had a little extra, whenever a neighbor got into trouble and needed to sell fast, Frank bought. A 40-acre woodlot here, a creek-bottom pasture there, an old commercial lot in town that everybody thought was worthless until the highway came through. He put it all in a little folder in the bottom of the safe, and he never bragged about it, never spent a dime of it. And near the end, when a developer offered him a number for the highway lot alone that made me sit down hard on the porch steps, he just folded the letter up and said, "We'll let it grow a while longer, Nell." All told, the land Frank left me was worth somewhere north of $1.4 million. And my children didn't know a thing about it. They'd grown up in a house where we clipped coupons and drove trucks until the wheels fell off. In their minds, their parents were sweet, simple, poor country people. And the whole of the inheritance was that 81,000 and a drafty old farmhouse they'd already decided I couldn't be trusted to live in. I didn't tell them. God help me, I didn't tell them. And I've asked myself 100 times since whether that was cruel or whether it was the smartest thing I ever did. And I've come to believe it was neither. It was a test. I just didn't decide to make it a test on purpose. It happened on its own. I kept the secret and I watched, and my children, thinking there was only a small pie to fight over, showed me exactly who they were when they thought nobody with any power was watching. The dinner I told you about, the one at the start, that came about 11 months after the funeral. All three of them, home at the same time, which almost never happened. Diane organized it. She called it a family meeting, which should have been my first warning. Because families that love each other don't hold meetings, they just have dinner. I made a roast and my mother's rolls and an apple pie, and I set the good table, and I let them come. And after the plates were cleared, Diane took out a folder. I remember the folder, manila, crisp, with a little tab. She set it on the table where the pie had been, and she folded her hands on top of it, and she said, "Mom, we love you. And because we love you, we've been talking, the three of us. And we think it's time to get some things in order. For your own good. For my own good." There's a phrase that has covered more sins than a church roof. She opened the folder. Inside were brochures, glossy ones. A place called Whispering Pines, an assisted living community 40 minutes away, with photographs of silver-haired women laughing at a craft table and a man doing water aerobics. Diane slid one across the table to me like she was doing me a favor. "It's beautiful, Mom," she said. "There's a nurse on staff. There's activities. You wouldn't be alone." Alone. There was that word again. They kept using it like it was a diagnosis. Michael leaned in. "And here's the thing, Mom. If we sell the farm, that's real money." Diane ran the numbers. After Whispering Pines takes their part, there'd be plenty left over. And that money Dad left, the 81, we could finally put that to work instead of letting it rot in a bank. We could put it to work. Carol was crying already, of course. Soft, pretty tears. "I just worry about you out here, Mama, every night. What if you fell? What if something happened and nobody knew for days?" And Diane, closing the trap so smooth you almost didn't feel the metal, said, "We already talked to a lawyer. just to understand the options. And honestly, Mom, at your age, it makes sense to think about putting the accounts in one of our names. Mine, probably, since I'm closest and I understand this kind of thing. Just so somebody can manage it if you're not able to. It's completely standard. There it was, the whole of it, laid out on the table where the pie had been. Sell my house, move me into a facility, put my money in Diane's name, and every word of it dressed up in love, wrapped in worry, tied with a bow that said, "For your own good." I want to tell you I stood up and I roared like a lion. I didn't. I've never in my life roared. I'm not built for it. Instead, I sat very still, and I felt something inside me, something that had been curled up and grieving for 11 months, uncurl and stand up and start very quietly to pay attention. I looked at the three faces of the children I'd carried and fed and stayed up nights with, and I saw, plain as the salt on the table, that not one of them had asked me what I wanted. Not one had asked if I was lonely, or how my heart was, or whether the nights were hard. They'd asked about the accounts. They'd run the numbers on my house before their father's headstone had even settled. They loved me. I truly believe that. But they'd already filed me under the past tense. So I smiled. I reached over and I patted Diane's hand, the one folded on top of that folder, and I said, "You've all put so much thought into this. I can see that. Let me sit with it. This is a lot for an old woman to take in at once. Give me a little time." And they relaxed. Every one of them. I watched the relief go across their faces, and it near about broke my heart, because I understood that my agreement was what they'd come for, and my hesitation had been making them nervous. They wanted the sweet, biddable mother who'd say yes, and I gave her to them, that night, for one more night. I poured Diane more coffee. I sent Carol home with the leftover pie. I let Michael hug me too long and tell me I was the best mother in the world. And the next morning at 9 o'clock sharp, I drove my truck into town to see a lawyer named Ruth Kessler, whose card I'd been carrying in my purse for 3 weeks, and I changed my will. Now, I need to back up and tell you how I came to have Ruth Kessler's card in my purse in the first place, because it matters, and because it's the part of this story that I'm proudest of, even though there's no pride to be had in any of it, only sadness and a hard kind of clarity. About a month after the funeral, when I was still moving through my days underwater, I got a letter, handwritten, from a man named Tom Petrick, who I hadn't thought about in years. Tom had been Frank's best friend since they were boys, closer than brothers, and then about 15 years back they'd had a falling out over something so stupid neither of them could ever quite explain it, a disagreement about a property line that curdled into silence, and they never spoke again. It was the great sorrow of Frank's later life, that silence, though he was too proud to fix it, and so was Tom. The letter said Tom had heard about Frank. It said he was sorry, sorrier than words could hold, and that he'd been a stubborn old fool, and so had Frank, and that the thing they'd fought about wasn't worth 1 hour of the friendship they threw away. And then it said something that stopped me cold. It said, "Now, I don't know how much Frank told you about his business, but I know your husband was a smarter man about money than anyone ever gave him credit for. If you ever need someone in your corner who knew him, who knew how he thought, I'm here. And whatever you do in this next part of your life, be careful who you let hold the pen. Grief makes us sign things. I learned that the hard way when my Ruth passed. Be careful who you let hold the pen." I read that line about 40 times, and then I drove out to Tom Petrick's place. The first drive I'd taken anywhere but the grocery and the cemetery in a month. And that old man met me at his door with tears in his eyes, and we sat on his porch and we talked about Frank for 4 hours. And near the end, when the sun was going down, I told him about Diane and the church kitchen and the way my children had started circling. And Tom got very quiet, and then he went inside, and he came back out with a business card. "This is Ruth Kessler," he said. "No relation to my Ruth, just a name. She handled everything for me after my wife passed and my own kids got funny about the money. She's honest, which is rarer than you'd think in that business, and she doesn't scare. You go see her before you sign one single thing. You promise me that, Nell." I promised him. And I put that card in my purse, and I carried it for 3 weeks while my children circled and closed in, and the morning after that dinner, I finally used it. Ruth Kessler turned out to be a woman about 60 with reading glasses on a chain and an office that smelled like old paper and good coffee. I sat down across from her and I told her the whole thing, all of it. The land Frank had bought, and the 81,000, and the folder full of brochures and the accounts they wanted in Diane's name. And when I finished, Ruth took off her glasses, and she looked at me for a long moment, and she said something I will never forget. She said, "Mrs. Nell, I'm going to ask you a hard question, and I want you to really think about the answer. If your children knew the truth, that there was $1.5 million in land and not just the 81, do you believe they would treat you better or worse?" And I sat in that office and I thought about it honestly, the way you can only think when a stranger asks you the question your own heart's been too scared to ask. And I knew the answer. I knew it the way I'd known Frank was gone before I touched him. Worse. They would treat me worse. The 81,000 had already turned my daughter into someone who ran numbers on my house at a funeral. $1.5 million would not make her kinder. It would make the circling into a feeding. I told Ruth that, and she nodded, slow, like she'd already known the answer and just needed me to find it myself. And then she said, "All right, then let's make sure the pen stays in your hand." Over the next 3 weeks, quiet as anything, Ruth and I built something. We didn't just change the will, we built a wall. First, the will itself. The old will, the one Frank and I made 20 years ago, split everything 3 ways, equal, like most parents do. We tore that up. Not out of spite, out of clarity. Because a person who tries to take your independence while you're still alive has already told you what they'll do with your legacy when you're gone. The new will did this. The farm, the 160 acres and the house went into a trust that could not be sold as long as I drew breath. And after me, it went to be a nature preserve in Frank's name, open to the public, because Frank loved that land more than he loved almost anything. And the idea of Diane subdividing it into cul-de-sacs made me feel sick down in my stomach. The land Frank had bought over the years, the real money, was to be sold after my death and the proceeds split. But not the way you'd think, not 3 ways. I gave the largest share, 40%, to Carol's children, my grandchildren. Because whatever Carol's faults, she'd raised 2 kids who wrote me actual letters, who came and sat with me and asked about my life and never once, not one time, mentioned money. I put their share in a trust they couldn't touch until they were 30, so nobody could get at it through them. I gave 20% to Tom Petrick's grandchildren, because Tom had reminded me, when my own children forgot, what it meant to be in somebody's corner. Frank would have wanted it. 2 old fools, reunited too late. And this was my way of saying the friendship mattered more than the fight. I gave a good chunk, another 20%, to build and endow that nature preserve, so the land would be cared for and Frank's name would sit on a sign that children would read for 100 years. And to my 3 children, my Diane and my Michael and my Carol, I left the $81,000, split 3 ways. Exactly the money they thought was all there was. Exactly the pie they'd been fighting over, not a penny more. I want to be clear about something, because I've turned it over in my mind on 1,000 sleepless nights since. That was not revenge. It felt like revenge for about an hour, and then it just felt like truth. My children believed there was $81,000 and a house. I let their belief be their inheritance. They got exactly the thing they schemed for. The fact that there was so much more and that their scheming was precisely the reason they'd never see it, that wasn't me punishing them. That was them punishing themselves over a slow 11 months, one cold calculation at a time, and me simply declining to save them from it. But the will was only half of it. The will is for after you're dead. The real danger, Ruth explained to me, was for while I was still living. Because what Diane really wanted, what all that talk about accounts in her name really meant, was control now. Today, access to my money and my decisions while I still had a pulse. And that's where old people get destroyed, not in the will, in the years before, when a loving child with power of attorney can drain an account, or sell a house, or sign their mother into a home, all perfectly legal, all for your own good. So we built the wall for the living too. Ruth helped me set up a revocable trust for the $81,000 and my day-to-day money with a professional trustee, a bonded company, not one of my children, who would only act on my written instruction as long as I was of sound mind. And Ruth got 2 doctors to sign letters that very week attesting that I was as sound of mind as any woman my age in the county, sounder than most, which felt good to have in writing. We put in place a power of attorney, but not to Diane. To Ruth, and to a second lawyer as backup, with strict instructions that could not be triggered unless two separate doctors declared me incapable. And even then, the house could never be sold, and I could never be moved from my home against a written wish I signed that very afternoon, in ink, that said, Eleanor stays in her home. Eleanor decides. In her hand or in her grave, the pen stays with her. Ruth read that last line back to me and smiled and said, "That's not standard language, you know." And I said, "Neither am I, apparently. I'm just finding it out at 71. I have to tell you about the afternoon it almost went the other way. Because I don't want you thinking I was some clever fox the whole time, 3 steps ahead. I wasn't. There was a Tuesday, right in the middle of those 3 weeks, when Diane drove out unannounced with her own lawyer's paperwork. And she nearly got me. She came in the door with a coffee cake and a warm smile and a leather folder. And she sat me down at my own table. And she was so kind that afternoon, kinder than she'd been in years. She talked about when she was little. She talked about Frank and how he used to carry her on his shoulders through the orchard. And I'll be honest with you, I got soft. Grief will do that. You get so hungry for the person you lost that anybody who'll sit and remember them with you starts to feel like a lifeline. And when she'd softened me up good, she slid a paper across the table and she put a pen next to it. One of Frank's pens, from the cup by the phone, and she said, "It's just a durable power of attorney, Mom. Completely standard. It just means if you ever get sick, if you ever can't make it to the bank, I can handle things for you so you don't have to worry. It doesn't change anything today. It just protects you." And I picked up that pen. I want you to know I picked it up. My hand was on Frank's pen, and the paper was right there, and my daughter was smiling at me with tears in her eyes, talking about the orchard. And every lonely bone in my body wanted to sign it just to feel close to somebody again. And then I heard Tom Petrick's voice, plain as if he were standing in my kitchen. "Be careful who you let hold the pen. Grief makes us sign things." I set the pen back down, and I said, "This is thoughtful of you, Diane. Let me have my lawyer look it over first, that's all, just so I understand it." And the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Her smile stayed, but her eyes went flat, and she said, too quick, "You don't need a lawyer for this, Mom. It's routine. It's just between us." And that, right there, was the tell. Because an honest paper doesn't mind being read by another set of eyes. Only a trap needs you to sign it fast, alone, before anybody sensible can look. I kept my voice gentle, and I kept saying I'd have it looked over, and she finally packed up her leather folder and her uneaten coffee cake, and she left angry, and I sat at that table shaking, because I'd come within 1 inch, 1 stroke of Frank's pen, of handing my whole life away for the price of 1 warm afternoon. I brought that paper to Ruth the next morning. She read it once, and she took off her glasses, and she said, "Mrs. Nell, if you had signed this, your daughter could have moved you, sold anything of yours that wasn't nailed down, and drained every account you have, all of it legal, and you'd have had no way to stop her. This isn't protection. This is a key to your life with your name on the tag." I felt sick the whole drive home. That's how close it runs, for old people. That's how a good afternoon and a familiar pen can end a person. I never told Diane I'd found out what it really was. I just quietly built my own wall instead and let her think I'd forgotten all about her paperwork. It took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of quiet mornings driving into town while my children thought I was sitting home stewing myself towards saying yes to Whispering Pines. And the whole time they kept at me. Diane called every few days, real sweet, asking had I looked at the brochures, and I'd say I was looking. I was thinking. Michael texted me an article about how much farms like mine were selling for. Carol cried on Sunday and said she just wanted to know I was safe. And I let them believe I was softening. I let them believe the old woman was finally coming around. And then Ruth called and said the papers were ready, and I drove in and I signed my name, Eleanor, in my own hand on every page. And I walked out of that office a free woman. And I sat in my truck in the parking lot and I cried for about 20 minutes. Not from sadness, or not only. I cried because Frank would have been so proud, and he wasn't there to see it, and because I'd finally done the thing he'd spent 49 years quietly trying to teach me, which was to know my own worth and hold on to it with both hands. Then I dried my eyes and I drove home, and I called my 3 children, and I invited them all to Sunday dinner. Because a thing like this, You don't do it in a letter. You do it at your own table, looking them in the eye, the way Frank would have. They came, all three, and this time, Diane brought her husband, and Michael brought the boat-selling swagger, and Carol drove up the night before. And I made the roast again, and the rolls, and I let them eat, and I let them think, from the softness of my face, that I'd called them there to say yes. When the plates were cleared, Diane, right on schedule, reached into her bag for the manila folder. But before she could open it, I put my hand flat on the table, the way Frank used to when he had something to say, and the whole room went quiet, because I'd never once in my life done that. I said, "Put the folder away, Diane. We're not going to be needing it." She blinked. "Mom, I've made my decisions," I said. "All of them. I saw a lawyer, my own lawyer, one you don't know. I've settled everything. My affairs are in order, more order than they've ever been in my life. And I want to tell you what I've decided, because you're my children, and you deserve to hear it from me and not from a letter after I'm gone." You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. I told them I was staying in the house, that it was in a trust and it could never be sold, not by them, not by anybody, and that when I was gone, it would become a park in their father's name where their own grandchildren could walk. I told them there was to be no whispering pines, not now, not ever, not unless the day came that 2 doctors and I myself agreed, and that I'd signed papers making sure of it. I told them the money their father left, all of it, was handled, protected, in a trust with a professional trustee, and that no one of them would ever have their name on my accounts or their hand on my decisions while I lived. Diane's face was going through something red, then white. "Mom, this is exactly what we were afraid of. Some lawyer took advantage of you. Some stranger got in your head." "Ruth Kessler," I said. "Tom Petrick sent me to her, your father's oldest friend. And no one got in my head, Diane. Somebody finally got me out of it. Out of the fog you've all been so happy to keep me in." Michael was starting to sweat. "Mom, come on, we were just trying to help. We were trying to protect you." And here's where I said the thing I'd been carrying for 11 months. I looked at my son and I said, gentle, because I did love him, "Michael, you offered to manage $81,000 of my money not 4 weeks after your father died. You've never once managed to hold on to your own. You didn't come out here to protect me. You came to get in front of the money. And I don't hate you for it. But I'm not blind anymore, and I'm not going to pretend to be blind so you can be comfortable." Carol is crying, real crying now, not the pretty kind. "So that's it? You don't trust us? Your own children?" And I told her the truest thing I know, the thing this whole hard year had taught me. I said, "Carol, I love you 3 more than my own life. But loving someone and handing them the keys to your life are 2 different things. And it took me until I was an old widow to learn the difference. You never asked me how I was. Not once in 11 months. You asked about the house. You asked about the money. You ran the numbers on my life while I was still living it. And a mother can forgive that. And I do. I forgive all of it, sitting here right now. But forgiving is not the same as forgetting. And it is surely not the same as signing everything I have over to the people who did it." Nobody said anything for a long time. And then Diane, my sharp, cold, brilliant Diane, said the thing that told me everything. She didn't ask if I was all right. She didn't ask about the park or the trust or her father's name on a sign. She said very quietly in a voice I'd never heard her use, "How much is the estate, Mom? The whole thing. What are we actually talking about here?" And I looked at my daughter, and I understood that she'd smelled it. Some part of her had always suspected there was more, and I made a decision right there at the table that I have never once regretted. I said, "The 81,000, split 3 ways between you. That's your inheritance, and it's the same as it always was. And it's more than most folks leave. What else there is, and whether there's anything else at all, is between me and my lawyer and the good Lord. You'll find out what you need to know when you need to know it. And if that's not enough for you, Diane, if the mother sitting in front of you isn't enough, and you need to know the size of the number before you can decide how to feel about me, then you've just answered a question I've been asking myself for a year." She didn't have anything to say to that. For the first time in her life, my daughter had nothing to say. They left that night quiet. No hugs held too long, no pie sent home. Diane's husband shook my hand at the door, and he was the only one who looked at me straight, and he said, low, so the others couldn't hear, For what it's worth, Nell, I think you did exactly right. And then they drove off down my long gravel driveway, 3 sets of taillights getting smaller. And I stood on my porch in the cool spring night, Frank's porch, our porch, and I did not feel alone. That's the thing I most want you to hear. Everyone had told me over and over that I'd be alone. My children had used the word like a weapon. And standing there that night, having finally drawn the line, I have never in my life felt less alone. Frank was in that house. 49 years of him was in every board, and I was still there. Eleanor was still there, holding the pen. I'd be lying if I told you it was all tied up neat after that. Life doesn't tie up neat. Diane didn't speak to me for 4 months, and those were hard months, because whatever she is, she's my firstborn, and there's a rope between a mother and her first child that doesn't ever really cut. But she came back around, slow. She called one Sunday in the fall, and she didn't mention money, not once. And she asked me how my heart was, and I heard something in her voice that I hadn't heard since she was a girl. It was the first honest conversation we'd had in maybe 20 years. I think the line I drew scared her. And then, somewhere under the scare, it woke her up. She started coming out to the farm just to sit, just to be with me. We planted a garden that next spring, the two of us on our knees in the dirt, not talking about anything at all. And it was the best afternoon I'd had since Frank died. Michael took longer, and Carol drifts in and out the way she always has, needing things, meaning well, never quite growing all the way up. But here's what changed. And it changed because I finally stopped pretending. Once they understood that the money was truly out of their reach, once the circling stopped because there was nothing left to circle, something strange happened. The relationship got real. When there's nothing to be gained from an old woman, the only people who keep coming around are the ones who actually want her. And it turned out I had more of those than I feared and fewer than I'd hoped. And knowing the true number at last was worth more than all the false comfort in the world. Tom Petrick and I got close those last years of his life. 2 old people who'd loved the same man in different ways, keeping each other company. He passed 2 winters ago, and I sat with him at the end the way he'd told me to sit with my own decisions, and I held his hand, and I thanked him, because his one letter and one business card saved the last chapter of my life from the people who thought they already owned it. I'm 74 now. I still live in the farmhouse. The land is still Frank's land, and one day it'll be a park with his name on a sign. And I like to think about children 100 years from now walking under the trees he loved, not knowing a thing about the family drama that saved those trees from the bulldozers. The trustee sends me a statement every quarter that I barely read. I don't need the money. I never did. I just needed it not to be a leash. And I'll tell you the thing I've learned, sitting on this porch, in case you're a widow or a widower yourself, or you love one, or you're going to be one someday, which, if you're lucky enough to love somebody long enough, you will. They will tell you that you're alone. They will say it like it's a fact, like it's a sickness. Like being alone means you can't be trusted with your own life. Do not believe them. Being alone is not the same as being helpless, and being old is not the same as being finished, and grief is not the same as being unable to think. The people who most want to help you make decisions are very often the people who benefit most from the decisions they want you to make. That is not cynicism. That is just something an old woman knows, the way she knows a storm is coming from the smell of the air. Keep the pen in your own hand. Whatever else you do, whatever they say, however they cry, however they love you or claim to, keep the pen in your own hand until the day you truly can't hold it. Because the moment you give it away, you stop being a person and you become an estate. And you are so much more than an estate. You are a whole life. You are 49 years of somebody's love and a garden you planted and a name you kept and a will, in every sense of that word, a will that is yours and yours alone. My family thought I'd be alone forever. Then I changed my will. And in doing it, I didn't lose my children. I found out which parts of them were real, and I built something true on what was left. That's not a sad ending. Down here on this porch in the evening light, with Frank's land stretched out gold in front of me, it feels like the truest happy ending an old woman could ask for. My name is Eleanor. Most people call me Nell. And I am not alone. I never was.